All right, good evening and welcome to the Thursday, July 28th, 2022 regular meeting of the Walnut Creek Planning Commission. At this time, I'll ask Commission Secretary Andy Smith to please call the roll.
Commissioner Needing?
Here.
Commissioner Lezak?
Here.
Commissioner Strongman?
Here.
Commissioner Anderson?
Here.
Vice Chair Ward?
Here.
Chair Reiser?
Here.
And Commissioner Pickett is absent tonight. But we do have a quorum with 6.
Recording in progress.
And now we're recording.
Very good, thank you. Next up on the agenda is the consent calendar. We actually, as a commission, have our first consent item in quite a bit on the calendar. So at this time, I'll ask if any commissioner wishes to pull in the item for consent for discussion. Seeing none, I'll ask if there's any members of the public that wish to comment on an item on the consent calendar. Anybody online? Anybody in the studio audience?
I would ask any attendees who are on Zoom if they wish to comment on an item that's on the consent calendar. This is for the Lunacy Lounge. And there the hand goes back down, I had a feeling. If you wish to comment on this item, please raise your hand. And I'm seeing no hands go up.
All right, seeing none, the chair would entertain a motion to pass consent, approve consent calendar.
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Can we get a roll?
Yes, Commissioner Needing?
Yes.
Commissioner Lezak?
Yes.
Commissioner Strongman?
Yes.
Commissioner Anderson?
Yes.
Vice Chair Ward?
Yes.
Chair Reiser?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you, Andy. Moving on, our public communication. The public communication portion of the meeting is reserved for the comments on items not on the agenda. Under the Brown Act, the commission cannot act on items raised during public communications, but may respond briefly to statements made or questions posed. Request clarification or refer the item to staff. So I'll ask at this time, are there any members in the chamber that would like to address the commission under public comment? Seeing none, anybody online?
I ask if anybody is attending online wishes to provide public comment for an item that is not on tonight's agenda, so that would not include the housing element, to please raise their hand. And I just saw a hand go back down, so that we have nobody raising their hand at the moment.
Very good, thank you. So next item on the agenda is our one and only public hearing. So I'll start by asking if any member of the commission has had any ex parte communications related to items on this evening's agenda.
I had email exchange with Andy.
Okay, very good. If that's the case, we probably all did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would clarify that I did speak to Andy for a while, but I wouldn't consider speaking to city staff as an ex parte communication. I would say that that's someone outside of the staff.
Okay.
When in doubt, disclose, disclose, disclose. All right, so moving on, first public hearing is the 2023 through 2031 Housing Element Update, General Plan Amendment, starting out with a staff presentation by our very own Andy Smith. Take it away, Andy.
Mr. Chair, Commission, this is on. Take my Commission Secretary hat off for a moment and put my Senior Planner hat on. I'm Andrew Smith, Senior Planner with the City of Walnut Creek, Head of Long Range and Transportation Planning, and also the Interim Housing Manager. And we are setting up right now to share the screen, get the PowerPoint going remotely here. Almost there. Isn't technology great? PowerPoint, while he is working on this, I will say that I have on many occasions become frustrated with PowerPoint because for some reason the default setting for which is the presentation screen versus the one for the speaker to see behind the scenes is always the one that you don't want it to be on. And so that's what's happening right now. So HIDA is switching that over so we can go into presentation mode on what you are all seeing. Well, and while that's happening, I'll just go ahead and open this by saying, so what we have here tonight is actually really a major milestone of work by the city and our consultants, and I'll introduce them in a minute. And housing elements have been in the news more than they have in years past, I would say. As you all will remember from, I think it was in March when we came to the commission last, and we're speaking about, among other things, the city's RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, basically our housing allocation that we have to plan for through the housing element. It's a lot larger this time than in previous cycles, and that's across the board throughout the state. And there are a lot of cities, admittedly, that are really having a hard time being able to plan for their new and much larger arena. Whereas here in Walnut Creek, due to many years of strong leadership, both by the city council and this commission, and good forward planning, we have been able to really address our housing needs within our existing zoning. As you have no doubt seen in the staff report and in the draft element, we do not have a program to do additional rezonings because we don't need to, essentially, where we have the capacity. Similarly, we have a lot of existing progressive housing policies and housing programs that speak to what are now state requirements, where in many ways Walnut Creek was really ahead of the curve. And yeah,
I think I can talk her through it.
Hita, we have help on the way. If I remember correctly, you want to go to display settings in the top left there, and I think you can just switch your monitor.
Okay, so Ida, go to the bottom middle, there's that monitor, to your left, that. No, it's not that one. Okay, go to the left, far left, I'm sorry, far left, not the pen. Keep going left. It's the box, the squares.
Not that one, the one to the right of that. Nope, not that one. That one. Is that it? No. I think it's under display settings if we go back to where it was.
You don't have the presentation?
No, Hita, if you could hit the back button there, that arrow. Go to display settings, right there. There you go. Swap presenter and slide view there. Oh, and you may need to unshare your screen. There we go. No, that's just me. Okay, she's unsharing. Change the setting. That was the other thing I remember struggling with Outlook, is that when you're doing it on Zoom, you have to unshare your screen, change the setting, and then reshare your screen. All while the public and everybody is watching you struggle mightily.
Makes it feel like it took 3 hours, but it did actually not take 3 hours.
Yes.
We've all been there.
I think it's because she's sharing in presenter mode.
Yes, that's what happened.
Yeah.
So she's unshared and can switch it.
Presenter mode, but nobody else sees that.
And of course, this is the one time, seriously, the one time when I don't have the local copy. I can get a local copy of the presentation if it needs to be, but this is the one time where we just relied on them having the slideshow remotely.
All good.
I'm going to step back over to my controlling computer and see if she's even in there still. I apologize.
You take a quick recess, or?
And then I'll ask Matt to promote Hita to a co-host. She is. Okay, Hita, go ahead and share your screen again. This is weird. Maybe we should take a break.
Can I get a motion to recess for 5? It's been made
I'll move.
and second. All in favor?
Aye.
We're recessing for 5. Thank you. Okay, very good. We're back from recess. Thank you for your patience.
And thank you for your patience. I do apologize for that. First time for everything for me, I guess. So I've already really given my intro, so let's go ahead and click to the second slide. Please let that work.
It's not. Click here. Got it. Okay. Okay.
There we go. Okay. So here is the team who's heading up this project. I'm, of course, the project manager for the city. We've also got Nancy Brigado from Brigado Planning, who is really acting as basically an adjunct to staff due to our, we have have some vacancies in our department, so she's been helping a great deal with that. And then the housing element consultants, Harrison Associates, headed up by Hita Mosesman, and project manager Orlando Martinez. And I'm actually going to be turning it over now to Hita to take over the rest of the presentation and to go over the draft housing element update that we are reviewing tonight. So I thank you again for your patience.
Thank you, Andy. I apologize. We're experienced a lot of technical difficulties in getting the presentation up for you, but it looks like we've resolved them. So I want to say good evening, everyone, Chair and members of the Planning Commission. My name is Hita Mosesman. I'm the Vice President of Community Development and Housing here at Harrison Associates. We are the city's housing element consultant, assisting in the preparation of that legally required document. And as Andy said, we're part of a team that includes city staff, Nancy Brigado from Brigado Consulting, working with city staff and almost acting as staff, and then myself and Orlando Martinez. By way of background, I just wanted to provide some context for why we're here and why you are looking at this document this evening. The housing element is a part of the city's general plan. It's required for every city and county in the state of California to be part of the general plan, and is the one element that needs to be updated every 8 years. So it is required by state law. Not only that, it's required to be updated every 8 years by state law to account for any changes in housing legislation and any changes in housing needs that arise. The city is assigned essentially a number of housing units. That assignment originates from the state of California, Department of Housing and Community Development, but it's ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, who takes a regional allocation, a large number, and then allocates and parcels out a number to every city and county within the region. So the RENA, as we'll discuss later in the presentation, the RENA is that assigned number that I've spoken about. That number is not decided upon by the city, but rather comes from the state and then from ABAG itself. So speaking of RENA, the RENA, as I refer to it, is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment Allocation, basically the assigned number of housing units that the city needs to plan for the next 8 years. And this is based on population projections that are completed at the state level. And the RENA is divided by income levels to allow for affordable housing needs for every community. And we'll go over what those income levels are as well. Additionally, this RENA number, HCD, or the Department of Housing and Community Development, requires that there be a buffer, or basically every city and county has to plan for more units than the RENA, which really acts as more of a minimum. That buffer per state guidance is 15 to 30% more units than what the RENA assignment is originally. So the table on your screen right now really shows what your RENA allocation is. The total is 5,805 units, but it's not just 5,805 units total. It's divided by different income categories, anywhere from extremely low and low income to what they call above moderate. These are legal terms in terms of these income categories, And it's basically dependent on what the area median income is or the average income of the area, the county. So low income would be those that make 50% or below the average income in the county. Low would be 50 to 80%. Moderate would be 80 to 120% of that average income amount. And then above moderate is over 120%, or what most people refer to as market rate housing. And as you can see, your RENA is about 60% affordable and about 40% market rate. So one really important component of the housing element is what's called the sites inventory. And that basically is a listing of potential or opportunity sites for planning purposes for housing, where housing could conceivably be developed in the next 8 years based on the best information available. Again, and I refer to state requirements often through the presentation, but state law does dictate what the contents of the housing element need to be. And one of those things is the site inventory listing, which is in the format provided by the state HCD template that provides information on each housing site, like the parcel number, the address, the zoning, the current use, the lot size, et cetera. That it can be found in your Appendix C. And again, this is a template that HCD provides that every city and county must follow and submit with their housing element as well. So the site inventory, or a list of opportunity sites, needs to be sufficient to accommodate at least with these buffers that we talked about, this 15 to 30% more units, 6,330 units total at different affordability levels that we just reviewed. So the draft housing element before you this evening can accommodate or has the capacity, potential capacity for 6,521 units. And of those, about 3,000 are for lower income households. And again, for planning purposes. So the good news is that because of the city's very forward-thinking and progressive planning efforts and the specific planning and rezoning that has occurred to date, it's not anticipated that any of the sites would need to be rezoned to accommodate the RENA plus the buffer that we talked about. So the map on this slide shows the location of these opportunity sites as presented in the housing element. What you see there with the color coding is indicating what the income levels are for the different sites. So blue would be lower income sites, meaning very low and low. The red would be moderate. And then the purple is a combination of both of those different income levels. You can see that a lot of the sites are clustered around transit and jobs as well, which is very consistent with state guidelines and actually the state guidance on their 2025 housing needs assessment for the state in total. There are 121 sites that have been identified. Again, they're located near transit and jobs, which is very consistent with state planning guidance. Housing resources is another required component of the housing element. And what we've seen through our research is that Walnut Creek is with progressive housing policies in Contra Costa County in being very pro-housing and securing a number of resources available for particularly affordable housing. So we put these different resources in buckets, generally federal, state, county, and regional, and then local. So on the federal level, the city does receive about $240,000 to $340,000 worth of Community Development Block Grant or CDBG funds every year for housing purposes. The city has also received 340 housing choice vouchers to use for affordable housing as of June of this year. The state level, the city has been very proactive in applying for available state grants, and there have been multiple awards of these state grants. The first is a grant that's commonly referred to as Senate Bill 2, because that's the Senate bill that established the funding, and it's for housing. And the city is currently utilizing that grant money to prepare designated ADU plans to make ADUs easier to build for residents. There's another grant called the LEAP grant, the Local Early Action Planning Grant, and the city's utilizing those funds to develop objective design standards to streamline housing development. There's yet another grant called the PLHA, or Permanent Local Housing Allocation Grant. The city expects to receive $830,000 total, and going to apply those funds towards, again, the objective design standards that are in process, as well as a right-sized parking study that is also in process. The city also obtained an award for the Local Housing Trust Fund grant of $1.9 million in matching funds from the state. And again, that is for affordable housing. We anticipate that there will be other state grants available over the next 8 years. And those grants, as we know them today, the ones that are available, are outlined in the housing resources section of the housing element. On a regional basis, there are several grants available focused around affordable housing and transit. There's the Advancing California Finance Authority grant, Metropolitan Transportation Commission grants, as well as One Bay Area grants, or OBAG grants. On the local level, in terms of the resources that the city currently has to date, the city has a local housing trust fund account. The balance of that account is currently $5 million. It includes revenues from inclusionary housing fees, as well as commercial linkage fees, and also the LHTF grant of $1.9 million that was secured from the state. The general fund provides about $100,000 per year to supplement the CDBG funding for housing, as well as provides for an allocation of $70,000 per year for services for unhoused residents. And then the housing successor entity, which is a holdover from redevelopment that was eliminated in 2011, and some low and moderate income housing funds that were left over at that point. There is about $500,000 available in that fund to be spent on affordable housing at the lowest income levels. Another component of the housing element is the identification of any affordable housing units that are technically income restricted by legal covenants that are at risk or are about to expire. There's always a time period that the units must remain affordable. And at the time of expiration, there's the risk of converting to market rate and no longer being affordable. We've identified 202 units in 3 projects in the city that have these upcoming expiration dates. However, they are at low risk of conversion because of the fact that they utilize Section 8 vouchers, which basically make up the difference between what a household can afford to pay in rent and about what the market rate rent is for the city. Because the property owner is essentially made whole with the use of Section 8 vouchers, these types of projects usually don't convert because the property owner is essentially receiving market rate rents for the most part. The other factor that tells us that the risk is low is the fact that all 3 of these projects are owned by nonprofit organizations. And again, there are potential funding sources identified in the housing resources section that could be utilized to provide some assistance if needed. Another requirement of the housing element pursuant to the law is to identify any constraints to housing development, and that would include any delays to housing projects. And what you'll see in the housing element chapter on constraints is an analysis of what those constraints are, but also what programs have been proposed to address or mitigate those constraints. I'd first like to start by saying that the constraints that are identified really fall into two buckets. The first bucket would be any type of potential zoning code changes that need to occur because California state law had changed related to affordable housing or emergency shelters. And a lot of that is really focused around minimum parking requirements. So because state laws changed, all cities and counties in the state have to make sure that their zoning ordinances are consistent with those new state law changes. The second bucket, the constraints bucket, are really market constraints and not governmental. So the city has some influence over mitigating those constraints, but they really do have to do sort of with the free private market. So the first in the bucket that would be sort of those state law changes where the city would have to make some modifications to be in compliance with state law are under the general heading of permit processing and procedures. And this is basically a state law that was enacted a few years ago that requires ministerial review and streamlined approval for certain types of affordable housing projects. So it's a statewide law, and city zoning has to be consistent. And also cities and counties have to adopt procedures for how those specific types of projects, these SB 35 projects, will be handled by the city. So that was identified as a constraint. There are no procedures to date, but they will be, pursuant to legal requirements, prepared in the implementation of the housing element. Second type of constraint had to do with the development or improvement of housing for persons with disabilities. And this really has to do primarily with parking requirements and a lack of funding for these types of housing facilities. So we do have two programs that would address and mitigate this identified constraint. So it'd be to provide funding where available for services and protocols for special needs housing in the community, and to also update the zoning ordinance to comply with state law similar to the previous constraint. And this really is focused around minimum parking requirements. And then lastly, the third in the bucket of state law changes and becoming compliant with those changes have to do with a section in the housing element called land use controls. And it really has to do, again, with another state law where CEQA is exempt for certain types of projects that are involving transit priority projects. So this program would essentially formally exempt these types of projects from CEQA in adherence with law. And so the first of the two market-oriented constraints that are identified are the availability and cost of land, which I think is widely reported. The programs that we have to address these constraints would be to maintain and update a very transparent site inventory so the development community understands where housing has been planned, and to also look at the parking study that's currently underway, the right sizing parking study, to look to see where parking requirements could be potentially lowered, which would of course allow projects to become more financially feasible and would allow more space for housing units. And lastly, construction costs and labor availability. Again, this is a market constraint, not a governmental constraint, but there is a program to help mitigate this. And that is to make all types of funding, whether it be federal, regional, state, or local, available, particularly for affordable housing, which costs more to develop than the revenues that are generated by those projects. Yet another component of the housing element update is a look back at the fifth cycle at the progress that was made during the last housing element cycle. And as a result of the city's leadership and very proactive housing policies, specific planning and rezoning, the city had accomplished in their annual progress report for 2021. There were 2,216 units that are either developed or in the process of going through planning and development. That includes 418 affordable units. Last cycle, the RENA, or that required number of housing units the city had to plan for, was 2,235 units. So from a total unit standpoint, not looking at income categories, but from a total unit standpoint, the city has achieved 99% of the total housing that was required during the last cycle. Additionally, there's some other milestones that are identified in the review section of the housing element. In terms of accomplishments, the Walnut Creek Transit Village project that was 600 units, ADU or accessory dwelling unit code changes, remove some constraints from developing ADUs. Objective design guidelines, as I mentioned before, are currently underway to streamline development. There's been quite a bit of regional collaboration on resources for the unhoused. And then the city's instituting of inclusionary housing requirements and commercial linkage fees to provide more funding for affordable housing. In terms of special needs housing in particular, the city funded the Eden Housing Council for Hope and Opportunity, which is focused on seniors. 129 lower income units were developed at sizes to accommodate larger families and female-headed households. For persons with disabilities, 15 units in the Arboleda project are set aside for disabled households. And the St. Paul's Commons project includes 44 affordable units for special needs populations as well. The city also utilized CDBG COVID funds for emergency rent and utility assistance to provide, emergency shelter and, resources for families and individuals. So at the start of the housing element process, there was a community engagement plan that was approved, and a very robust public participation process really followed that. There's an administrative record in Appendix A to the housing element for your consideration tonight that documents that administrative process that we followed, including copies of presentations. We did a community questionnaire of the community members on housing needs and challenges and opportunities, all the social media posts that went up to inform the community about the engagement, and all the methods that were followed in order to engage the community, including stakeholder focus meetings and public workshops. So to get into the specifics of what was done, we started the process, as I said, at the Planning Commission and City Council level with the community engagement plan. 2 community workshops were held virtually. Those community workshops also involved live polling to obtain sort of input in real time during those workshops. We had 4 stakeholder meetings with developers, both affordable and market rate, as well as nonprofit organizations, including fair housing service providers and other service providers in the community, as well as housing advocates, and to understand, needs, opportunities, how can more housing be accomplished in the community, both affordable and market rate. There is a dedicated website for the housing element update process that provides resources, links, and information about how the community can be engaged throughout the process to the point of certification. As I said, there was an online community questionnaire, and we had a really good amount of responses on that and some very important input for this process. There were flyers provided at events like the farmers market and posted at public facilities to inform the community. There was an article in the nutshell to date with more to follow as we go through this process. And the city has mailing lists of an interest list of various types, including for housing. And emails went out to community members, and there were over 3,000 recipients of those emails. The community questionnaire, just to get into that a little bit and talk a bit about what the takeaways were from that process. So the community questionnaire was posted in early March. 112 responses were received. The major takeaway was that affordability was the primary issue from the respondents. We asked a lot of questions about how people feel about housing in the community. The most important factors based on response in choosing housing were cost and the desirability of the neighborhood. 64% of respondents replied that they would like to own a home in Walnut Creek, but affordability is a challenge and an issue preventing them from doing that. 78% stated that they felt that housing was not affordable. 59% have either left the city or know someone who has left the city due to affordability challenges. And the top program priorities identified by respondents were to allow housing in commercially zoned areas, which I think the site inventory really ties well with that important piece of input, and also to provide more fair housing services as well. So the housing plan in the housing element, the last chapter, chapter 8, provides the goals, policies, and programs the city will sort of implement and undertake over the next 8 years to achieve or to facilitate housing development in the community. Many of these goals and objectives really didn't change from the 5th cycle, while others might have been modified to reflect current practices, as well as changes in state laws. We did add some new goals and policies and programs to build upon the success that the city has seen to date and to implement this larger RHNA or housing requirement that needs to be planned for. There are a number of programs and actions in the housing plan. We've listed some of these in the presentation. Encouraging and incentivizing ADUs is a good way to build housing, especially affordable housing. Providing technical assistance to developers. Providing assistance with lower income housing, both as funding is available, as well as some streamlining. To provide education on density bonuses. To advertise available housing resources as we have done in the housing resources section of the housing element. To update the city's zoning ordinance, not necessarily for land use or the site inventory, but really to comply with state law changes that have occurred over the last 5 years. To continue to monitor affordable housing units that might be at risk and try to preserve those units as best as possible. To undertake displacement prevention and to provide legal assistance and information for renters. A new section of the housing element for this 6th cycle is called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing section. And that section is about identifying demographic information, environmental information, and fair housing information to inform about any types of contributing factors that contribute to fair housing challenges or issues in the community. As a result of that analysis, again, based on a lot on widely reported data like census data, environmental data from the state of California, we identified 5 contributing factors. And again, I don't know that there is a community in California that doesn't identify at least some factors. And probably the most important that is probably the same in every community is a lack of access to housing opportunity. And what we mean by that in Walnut Creek is that there's not enough affordable housing for those who need it. And that's really an issue that is occurring throughout the state of California at this time. So we did identify programs similar to the constraints to mitigate and address the issues that we found. One such program is to assist with lower income housing. So that would be the very low and the low income housing. To fund incentives and concessions for extremely low income developments to allow them to be financially feasible, and to assist faith-based organizations with affordable housing developments. There's been quite a bit of activity with faith-based organizations in Walnut Creek and sort of continuing those successes. Displacement risk was another factor that was identified. Again, a lot of this ties back to affordability. When households are unable to afford rents or mortgages, that's where you have potential displacement risk. Programs to address this would be collaborating with community organizations to identify those vulnerable populations who might be at risk, to institute displacement prevention activities to the best of the city's ability, and to provide legal assistance to renters so that renters can understand what their rights are in the process if they are having fair housing issues. Fair housing enforcement was also identified as a contributing factor that came from the community questionnaire as well as some of the data. Programs to address that would be funding to support fair housing, legal assistance for renters, and to provide information on what renters' rights are on the city's website as it relates to fair housing. Environmental hazards were also identified. This had to do with levels of pollution, particularly near major routes and highways. Programs to address this really have to do with emissions, so residential energy conservation programs, energy efficiency and conservation, and reducing exposure to environmental pollution. And then lastly, a contributing factor was lack of regional and local cooperation, or really needing more of that. Those programs would include mortgage credit certificate program on a regional basis, coordinating with the county as it relates to the provision of affordable housing, and additional regional collaboration as it relates to homelessness. So just that sort of concludes the summary, and I know that was a lot of the contents of the housing element from a high level. This slide is sort of a review of where we are now and what the next steps in the process are. So the housing element draft has been available to the public since July 21st as part of the Planning Commission's agenda packet. State law requires that the housing element be available for public review for a minimum of 30 days. And then there needs to be a 10 working day period to incorporate any comments that are received before it can be submitted to the State Department of Housing and Community Development for their required review. On August 2nd, the draft housing element will be taken to the City Council's HCD, or Housing and Community Development Committee, for review. On September 5th, the document will then will be submitted to the state HCD, the California State Department of Housing and Community Development, for their mandatory 90-day review period. Shortly thereafter, the document will be taken to the City Council for their review. State law technically requires that the quote, planning agency transmit the housing element draft to the to HCD. So it's really a planning commission function at this point of the draft phase, but the City Council will be considering and accepting the draft on September 20th. From there, December 3rd would be the end of the 90-day review period for HCD, and we expect that they will be in contact with any findings and comments and suggested edits that they may have. We anticipate that by January 11th, we'll be able to turn around the document and submit a revised draft, which is required by law. If there are any findings or comments, we must submit for a second review period. And that review period is abbreviated at 60 days. From there, we're anticipating the certification of the document in the spring. And at that point, it would be taken back to the Planning Commission and then ultimately to City Council for adoption to conclude the process. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your patience, especially with the technical difficulties. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you would have this time.
Well, thanks very much, Erlinda. That was a super easy to understand, high-level summary of a lot of detail that I know that has gone into that and a lot of work, so thank you. So I'll turn it over to the commission at this time. Any questions to start? Yes. Commissioner Lezak.
Hita, thank you for the presentation, and lots of thoughts and things we can talk about later. But the first thing that jumped out at me is that in the last cycle, that fifth housing element cycle, the city has done a fantastic job of, meeting or through the process that number of 2,000 something turned out to be fairly close to what we achieved. I saw 99% as the overall number. How did the city do percentage-wise in the breakdown of the individual income categories? And then second part of this question is, how does those percentages, whatever it is by category and overall, stack up against other cities in California in terms of are we on par, are we doing better, are we doing worse? And then the last question is, what are the ramifications to a city, Walnut Creek or otherwise, if they fail to meet their housing element numbers, their RENA allocation at a high, for the total target and or at various income levels? Thank you.
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that. I just wanted to clarify too, because of the technical difficulties with my computer, I'm actually using Erlinda Martinez's computer, so it shows me as, but I'm
sorry.
actually, yeah, no, I just wanted to clarify for all those that are listening in, and that I'm Hita Mosesman using Erlinda's computer. So I would say that, Walnut Creek's like a lot of other cities in California. Very few cities, if any, I'm not aware of any that met all of their affordable housing requirements for the fifth cycle RENA. And the reason for that, and I think the slide mentioned that there were, of the 2,200, 418 were affordable, which, that's a pretty good percentage considering, considering the current climate. The issue with affordable housing is that cities and counties don't have any local means for generating enough revenue to be able to subsidize affordable housing at the levels that it needs to be subsidized at. And what we had in a tool called redevelopment back in 2011 and before, cities did have a tool for raising revenues at a local level. And there was quite a bit of affordable housing built. Now that funding really comes from the state, and there isn't a sufficient amount. So I believe that's why a lot of cities couldn't meet their goals, because there isn't enough public funding to fill the gap that's in what it costs to build versus the revenue that is obtained from it, because you need to charge rents that are affordable to people or prices that are affordable. So those rents and prices are lower than the market would dictate. So I would say that, and also I want to clarify, there is no repercussion for not meeting your RENA at this time. The city is tasked with planning for housing, facilitating housing through the planning process. However, the state recognizes that developers build housing and, cities and counties don't. The state also recognizes, and it's actually in the government code, that, and I'll just paraphrase, that there isn't enough public money to fund affordable housing. And the state does acknowledge that, it is very difficult to achieve these numbers in those ways. So, I think that what I've heard from the state level is, if we build more housing, even if it's not at the affordable levels per urena, the more housing supply there is, the less rents and prices will skyrocket. There'll be some, at least, stabilization of growth in those costs. So I hope I answered your question. If there's a follow-up to that, I'd be happy to answer.
No, that's fine for now. Appreciate it.
Any other commissioners with questions? Commissioner Anderson?
Since there are a lot of cities, and perhaps most cities, whose primary concern is actually being able to find and allocate sites for the arena numbers, especially the larger numbers we're getting now. Since Walnut Creek is in the enviable position of having sites already identified to do that, what is your greatest concern as far as passing muster with the Housing Community Development Department?
I don't want to sound too overconfident, but we did significant analysis to provide substantial evidence that there is potential for the redevelopment of the sites that are included on the list. We looked at prior development patterns in the city. We even did an analysis of the ratio of the improvement value to the land value. And we identified those sites that had an improvement to land value ratio that was 1 or less, which indicates either you have a small building on a big lot, which would indicate that it's underutilized, or you have a building that is that could be reaching the end of its useful life. And there hasn't been much improvement or activity happening on that building. So that's an important data point, I think, to provide evidence that there's redevelopment potential, which is what the law requires us to do if there's a non-vacant site where we're saying affordable housing could potentially be built. The development patterns, you all made it easy for us because there has been so much housing built in the city, and there have been a lot of affordable housing units built as well. So we were able to demonstrate that it is possible here. It's achievable under your current zoning designations, under your development standards, and in the current market. And I know that, working with city staff, that density bonus has been used very successfully as well. The beauty of density bonus is that it doesn't require a public subsidy, right? And so it's a little bit easier to do, and it's a more streamlined process to do. So, we've seen an ability in Walnut Creek to accomplish housing at densities that we believe the state is going to be happy with, and providing that evidence with data points like looking at values, development trends. We also analyzed market data specific to Walnut Creek, almost to the extent of a mini market study that you do for like a land use element, sort of an abbreviated version of that, to look at what the trends are. What are we seeing with retail? What are we seeing with office? And, what is the redevelopment potential there? So based on what we understand, we have successfully gotten clients over the finish line with certification in Southern California. And based on what we've seen to date, what we have provided in the sites inventory chapter should meet the state's requirement.
Thank you. Commissioner Needing.
I have a few questions, but I just wanted to say a couple of, sorry, I had my notes on my phone. I forgot my notebook, so my husband sent the photo. First, I've had to read a couple of housing elements, and so I just have to say this was very thorough. I was just telling Andy this, even to the fact that you guys had you made people aware that even to build a home, I'm doing this by memory, but you had noted it would be about $556,000, so $500,000 just in directs, in tracks, impact fees, etc. So I commend you for just being very transparent about the fees. The other thing that I was going to say is a couple of things. You had discussed the developers forum and about really educating developers, which you made very clear in the housing element that that's how these houses are going to be built. And so I think it would be helpful or beneficial if a developers forum could also be done for the Housing Crisis Act, because I think that especially with the Attorney General in January creating the Housing Strike Force to really enforce that SB 330, Walnut Creek is ahead of the game using the density bonus. I know that you guys had mentioned the 1910 North Main project, which preempted that height limitation, but I think there's so much more education that can be done to the developers, and so I think that would be pretty amazing to do that. And it ties to your funds that you're using for SB 2 about creating the objective design guidelines, which is exactly what would be needed if someone were pursuing the HAA or Housing Crisis or Act SB 330 application. So those objective standards, if we can set those now, we're already ahead of the game to so many jurisdictions so that there's no questions about when those approvals happen. I would like to see that developers forum for education on that. It was nice to see the removal of limitations of no longer the exceedance of 5% of the number of single-family homes in a tract for ADUs. I've been following a lot of the Casita Coalition about what they're doing with regards to the recent ADU legislation. And so the first question, which is, sorry, I've been long-winded, is you guys had projected an approximately 196 total of ADUs. And so one of my questions is what is, number one, what is limiting that number of total ADUs? Secondly, there's a lot of neighboring jurisdictions that are actually doing deed restricted ADUs in order to increase the low or very low. So that's my question. Number one. And then number two, I've been following a lot of the Assembly Bill 1851 for the housing on the church properties. And I've kind of seen it, that I followed the tiny villages in Livermore to see how those were created. And so in the housing element, you had said that you had set a factor of 9% to 40% of the church sites. And then for the retail spaces, you did 50 to 60%. And so my question there, which is my second question, hopefully you remember the first one, is how did you come up with that 9% to 40%? Did you individually contact all of these churches in Walnut Creek to essentially define what parcels or what portions of their parking lots would be eligible for housing? Is that how that number came up? So those are the two questions. It's what is setting the 196, what's limiting the lower affordability of those 196 ADUs, and then how did that 9% to 40% come up for the church sites?
Sure. I'll answer your question on the ADUs. So the HCD guidance it tells us that they want to look at the average number of ADUs that have been permitted in the city the past 2 to 3 years, and they're limiting, basically limiting what you can show per year based on that. So we're looking at that, those actuals, and that's how we projected out the total number of ADUs. Again, trying to give place based on our, their guidance and our experience. The deed restricted, that's I know some cities are doing that. It can be a little bit of a challenge to do it because there's not you can't out and out require it. What I've seen cities do is provide incentives like waiving fees and other things. And that's definitely, that if the city would like to do that, that's something the city could do. But for the purposes of the housing element at this stage, in terms of where we are and like pursuant to the state mandated deadline, we would have to look at that as an additional program if the city would like to move forward with that. And that's, we're still in the 30-day review period. So that's something that, we would take city's direction on how you'd like to handle that moving forward. It's unclear to me because HCD is very, they want to see that you've done something before in order to accept that this is what's going to happen in the future. And so it may or may not result in being able to show some of your lower income RENA through the ADUs because they look for generally a track record on that. So that would be my only comment. But again, if the city would like it to direct us to edit the housing element, that's something we definitely can do.
No. I'm definitely not asking.
Okay.
Not asking for that.
Okay.
I was just curious how that got said because legislation is opening the door, and you're right. They do want to see that what we have permitted, and so I saw that data in the housing element. I think first things first is that the city took a good step forward by even changing the ordinance to accommodate ADUs, period. And the fact that we're also coming up with preset or pre-permitted plans for the ADUs, then that to me tells me that in the next cycle, which I won't be here anymore, is in 8 years from now, that it sounds like that could be maybe a forward planning thing that could be used in the future.
And this is a good point because one important part of this is that there's the housing element itself and what we're planning for, but the city, just like every other city and county in the state, has to prepare an annual progress report where you show the permits, the approved projects, things like that. So if we're saying that you're going to have, a little less than 200 ADUs and you end up with 400 ADUs, that's a good thing. And then if you end up with ADUs that are income restricted, those actually can count towards your RENA numbers on the affordable side to help you achieve the numbers that we've estimated. The tricky thing with the sites inventory is, it's our best, I don't want to say guess, because there was a lot of analysis that went into it, but it was based on what the legal requirements are for choosing sites and HCD guidance. We chose the sites that met that criteria. But it may be that, a site that we said, 100 units was going to be developed on doesn't get developed during this housing element period, but some other site that we didn't even include in the sites inventory did develop as a 100-unit project. I think what it is with HCD, and I think this is why the buffer that they require, they know that actual projects may not occur the same way that we've planned. And so, as long as the cities, when you're meeting your overall number, I think that's a good thing. And I think that if you somehow accomplish affordable ADUs where we said they would be, not as many affordable, that's also a good thing. And it'll bode well for the city because that's the actual, and that HCD is very focused on that. With your second question, we tried to estimate based on the parking lot space for the faith-based properties, how much of the property could be developable. And that's where you're seeing those percentages. So I hope that answers that question.
Perfect. Thank you.
I can also add that we actually did meet with members of the faith-based community as part of our stakeholder outreach to kind of gauge the interest in housing development on properties.
Vice Chair Ward.
Thank you. First of all, just exceptional work on this whole thing. It really was I learned a lot, and I really can see all the hard work that really went into it, so thank you very much for that. I did have a question about the sites inventory. I understand that it doesn't include sites where zoning would have to be changed, and that's considered to be a positive thing for us because of our good planning and other things. But it does seem that some of the most successful housing developments that have come have been where office buildings or business parks or failing shopping centers have been turned into residential condos or other housing, affordable housing particularly. So I'm wondering if we should expand and look for underutilized, blighted, or otherwise available areas in our community where zoning would have to be changed, but it's kind of a logical place where housing could go. And I understand we're trying to pass the test, but we actually also really do want to build housing. So maybe we need to expand, and I'm wondering what the barrier to doing that is.
Actually, let me go ahead and answer that one. So first, I think it's worth noting that just because the city can, of course, take additional pro-housing actions that are not in the housing element. We can, of course, go about rezoning programs, outside of the housing element, as long as HCD is okay with what we are proposing within the element. It's not a limiting factor. We can't go and down zone residential. We can certainly up zone or change to residential. And the question that you asked, in terms of changing like commercial zones, for example, that do not currently allow residential, there's a lot of factors that really have to be taken into account beyond just housing demand. Obviously, we have to balance the economic development, just the economic viability and vitality of the city, and opportunities there. There's of course things, your typical transportation, land use, and the like. And because for the housing element update, we're on a very tight timeline as per the state. We're not proposing to undertake, or we're not undertaking an effort like that as part of the housing element update. But again, of course, that is something that could be done separately. The council, if they wish to do that, outside of the every 8-year update that we do here. It's always a possibility.
Great, thanks so much, appreciate that.
Anyone else? I just have one quick technical question, and that's on another sites inventory question regarding that map where you showed the color-coded map of by income category, what would go where, et cetera, and it was spread throughout the city there. How is that arrived at? I know it's all theoretical, but how do you assign income category to a particular neighborhood within the city or certain buildings within the city?
I am trying to get back to the slide real quickly, just so that we can kind of look at it together. We have quite a few animations in here. Oh, here we go. Okay. Here we go. Okay, that's a really good question. And they've all been really good questions. So, basically the state has criteria for any non-vacant site that we're saying could be developed with affordable housing. And so the sites that you see there for lower, the ones in the blue, there were a number of factors that would point to it would be ripe for redevelopment. And based on development trends, there's the possibility, obviously we can't guarantee that funding will be there, but the conditions are right for affordable housing on those sites, because those are among the most, the data would point to, underutilized, having the least amount, it appears from the data, investment in them, and would have the least amount of barriers to development. Affordable housing, to pencil, the less barriers you have, the easier it would be for it to be feasible, because the time to, purchase the property, the zoning is in place, so that's very helpful, and then prepare the site and build, and potentially, the price that would be paid for the site, all kind of go in to point to it would be more viable for an affordable project as opposed to other sites that might be more viable for market rate, considering the condition of the site and the location of the site.
Okay. And
So
I
it-
realize do you have something to add, Andy? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was also going to add that one of the requirements, well, to oversimplify a point, in some ways, HCD equates density to affordability. In order to be able to count a site as being a site that could count towards one of the lower income household or housing, it has to meet a certain minimum density threshold. And it's either 30 or 40 units to the acre, I forget, in terms of what we would allow in the zoning. And so those densities, that's actually on the low end of the range of what we would allow in the core area, which is where a lot of the housing sites are located. You'll notice on the map where you get into the moderate or the market rate housing, the red colored ones, those tend to be around on the periphery where the allowable zoning, either the allowable zoning doesn't go, the density is not that high, or those are sites where we actually have an application on file, and so we know how many units, and we know that they're not going to be providing any significant number of affordable units. It's a market rate development that's in process. So that's kind of just another wrinkle.
Great
in that.
explanation, thank you. And then I realize it's all theoretical, but there's no enforcement that anybody could buy that lot particularly and develop it a particular way. It doesn't have to necessarily go in the direction that this plan is showing it to go regarding income affordability.
Yes, correct.
Right, thanks. And then one quick comment before we take it to those viewing at home. One number that I was a little bit shocked at in this whole presentation was just 112 responses from the community. I know you guys, us, the city, whoever, it was an amazing job of what we did in terms of public outreach and getting out there, but 112 responses for a city this size leaves a little something to be desired, I think, just a comment. So with that, any other questions here? We'll open it up then at this point to public comment. Anybody online I'll remind the speakers, anybody who's getting on it, they have 3 minutes.
So I know starting to see hands go up. If you are attending via Zoom, if you could please raise your hand if you wish to provide public comment. And I'm just going to let folks in the order that they happen to appear on my screen here, starting with Donna Colombo. And I will bring her in. It'll take a second here. Okay. Here we go. Okay, Donna Colombo's been added. Donna, you can go ahead. You can turn on your microphone, and if you wish, your camera.
Hi, Donna.
Hi. Sorry, it's taking a minute here. So I don't know where my video went. So I'm Donna Colombo, and I represent the Walnut Creek Homeless Task Force, as some of you know, and I'm also a resident of Walnut Creek. The housing element is such a large document. My comments may apply to more than one section, but for now, because of the time limit, I want to address the goals that are on page 8-15. The goals are very general, and they really don't have measurements. I think in order to make progress, there needs to be some kind of measurement that you take a look at. You mentioned in the presentation that you would review them annually and kind of look at where you're at. Well, without measurements, they don't really mean much. So in my mind, it would be set some measurements and track them annually. If you're building, my numbers you changed from when I did it, but if you're building, your goals are 2,871 units, very low, extremely low, then over 8 years, you'd only need to build 359 annually. Now, I know that's very general, but if you're reviewing it annually and you're tracking it, then it starts to mean something and you can take action. You can work on those programs that are not in the element, but would help you achieve your numbers. Also consider language establishing more flexible timeframes for review and approval, dependent upon the size of the development, as well as caps for associated fees, dependent upon affordability level and type of units. The tiny homes at Hope Village, which you referenced, it is taking over a year to get approvals for that. It's not necessarily all of the city planning department's fault. A lot of it is regulatory. However, if there was a way to, we're leveraging SB 2162. So leveraging legislation and taking a look at that annually, what's available, how can we increase the ability and shorten the timeframes. Currently, the approval process for Hope Village is up to a year, while site work and construction is a mere 40 days. That's crazy. These are pre-approved units by HCD, and it shouldn't take that long to approve them. So maybe adding some language around land use eligibility under AB 2162 would help, as well as some of the other legislation. And that's pretty rough. I will go through page by page and provide a written, some written comments. And I do appreciate, I know there's a lot of work that was done.
Thanks, Donna.
Okay, and let's go back to the attendees list. We have next up Jan Warren, and I will bring her in. There we go. Jan's coming in here. Jan, if you want to go ahead and unmute your mic, and you can turn on your camera if you'd like.
Hi, Jan.
Good evening. Appreciate the opportunity to speak. I have more things to talk about than 3 minutes, but I'll do what I can. The 2015-23 document is much easier for someone to look at than this current one, in which if you want to follow a piece of property, you have to, it goes for 1 page, and then you got to go down 5 pages and find the second part, and then you got to go down another 5 pages to find the rest of it. And so it's very difficult to follow. It's cumbersome. I did identify the lower income. I did go and look at them. I'm kind of surprised to see the Fremont Bank. A lot of these that we listed were there last time, the last cycle, 5th cycle. So the last cycle also identified, let's see, sites. Where did my numbers go? 69 residential opportunity sites. And this time we had all these screenshots, and they listed 227. And so I guess that's everything in the city, and then you took the ones out that you thought were most viable. Like I said, it's very hard for us to follow this stuff. And I also want to talk about the seniors and the fact that we already got a bunch of us old people, and there's going to be a lot more, and we need to work on finding ways to get funding for more housing. I looked at the goals. You put some of the specifics in there, but they're not enough, and that's not going to get us there. And we need to find ways, looking at the wonderful fee development, residential fee projects. It is incredibly expensive. If people are going to be building in this city and they want to build affordable housing, we've got to do something to reduce those fees. Let's see, what else have I got here? The manufactured homes can be built in all single residency zoning, and single room occupancy can be built anywhere multiple family housing is allowed. I think we need to begin to look at other options besides just the ones we look at every year. We need to, if we have most of our tracts are high resource or highest, only 3 are moderate. We have, it's a great city, and we should look at some planning that's beyond just, we can find things that meet the needs beyond just that super core area. I also want to comment on the site on Sharp Avenue and the fact that it's a super small site, 0.17. And you guys increased that availability of number of units ridiculously high. So I thank you, and I will submit written comments. Thanks.
Thanks, Jan.
Okay, And we've got one person left raising their hand, and I will let them in. This is going to be Mary Fuji. I apologize. Zoom is very slow in bringing people from being attendees. Here we go. Okay.
Welcome, Mary.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to put in my literally 2 cents. I was so pleased when I read the report, and I truthfully didn't make it all the way through, that affordable housing was being highlighted here. But I know as a member of the homeless task force and have seen Hope Village from, would this church be interested at that starting point to working on trying to get it going, that some of these goals, I mean, I appreciate that affordable housing is in there. I appreciate that the word homeless is in, the special needs and H3 and H4 just, I couldn't believe it. I wrote in my notes that it was going to be reducing the burden, and it's really worded as removing the government restraints. And it'll be great when it happens, but we just haven't seen it. And I really look forward to the city taking a real partnership with the churches and other agencies that are really trying to help get people off the streets, help get people to have some stability in their housing and not have that vulnerability of becoming homeless. I was impressed with the amount of research that was done for this report. And I do have a lot of optimism that the city of Walnut Creek will rise to this occasion and really be serious about increasing the number of units that are available for the extremely low, very low, and low income folks that are out there, and households, families that really need this housing. So I look forward to, as a member of the task force, to working with the city as much as I can contribute. I just want you to know I'm really in favor of the city putting some real life effort into this and actualizing a number of units available to these folks who desperately need them. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for your presentation. And yeah, I look forward to the future here because I think Walnut Creek's a great city, and I appreciate their emphasis on this very vulnerable population.
Thanks for your comments, Mary. Anybody else?
So let's see, there's one other attendee who's not raised their hand, so I would just give them one final chance to raise their hand if they wish to speak. And I'm not seeing a hand go up.
Going once, going twice.
So yeah.
All right, we'll close the public hearing then, bring it back to the commission. If there's any other questions, deliberations, comments, anybody? Commissioner Lezak.
I think I'll come back and echo the, I think we're all thinking, which is, you know, there's a lot here, and it's a lot that is a requirement of HCD, and our hands are limited to some degree. There's a lot of chapters and sections that have to be written in a particular way. And I really commend staff and the team for the work on the site's inventory. I agree that, you know, some additional inventory work outside of this would be helpful, because I look at this and I say, wow, this is a great opportunity for a developer forum or educating developers of this is where we want you to go. And the only comment that I also shared with you before was very similar to what Jan said. It's very difficult to read the site inventory the way it is now, but I don't see why that's a problem for it to be published, you know, the way, I mean, the information is good. I think that as part of repackaging this thing to send to the HCD, that's something that you might take a look at. But overall, I'm very in favor of moving this forward as a draft to the HCD. I think staff has done a very good job of meeting all those requirements, and this is a very difficult process. Unfortunately, I'm a little skeptical that we'll be able to meet, that the development community at large and affordable housing community will be able to step up to build this many units in that next 8-year period. Particularly if we've done 418 affordable units in the last 8 years, having a hard time seeing 3,000 in the next 8 years. But those comments are really not specifically directed at this exercise in the city. I'm hearing that from others. I know that we're going to do everything that we can behind the scenes to try to get that number to be as many as it can be. And it's unfortunate to some degree that there are no penalties or repercussions for cities for not meeting, because that might take this exercise to a slightly different level. But since this is the exercise before us, I think it's a great job. And other than those comments, I'm, in favor of moving this thing forward.
Hear, hear. Any other comments?
Mr. Chair, can I ask just for a clarification, if possible?
Absolutely.
Commissioner Lezak, with regard to the ease of reading I'm assuming you're referring to the tables in Appendix C, how they're split among pages. So, okay, yeah, we can.
Yeah,
start.
yeah. I mean, I'm not sure that I know the answer.
Yeah.
I just know that I, like Jim, when I'm looking at this thing on the screen, I eventually printed it and resorted it so that I could read it. And, I think it's just something that you guys can play with. The data, the information is there. I'm not really suggesting that you change that. I'm just not sure if there's a cleaner, easier way to shuffle the pages to make it easier for people to follow.
Okay, great, thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, with that, the chair would entertain a motion to authorize transmittal of the draft document to HCD for preliminary review and comment.
And might I ask again through the chair, if the comment provided by Commissioner Lezak, if that would be part of if the commission as a body wishes to make that as a formal recommendation, to be sure to include that.
To streamline the
Within the bounds of what we're legally allowed to do by HCD. I have no idea if they require the tables to be split. You would hope not, but God knows.
And again, this is more of a suggestion in terms of, I trust staff to go back and make this the best document they can. And based on that feedback, if this is what you got, this is what you got. I'm not telling you that that's a formal recommendation. I just think it's a strong suggestion that other than I had that problem, we've heard this from others.
I think it's a good suggestion. Without objection, we'll.
And I will say, I'll try to do that anyway, I agree. So
Okay.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and make the motion
Very good.
to advance. Thank you.
Second?
We have a motion and a second. Can we get the roll?
Yes, Commissioner Needing,
Yes.
Commissioner Lezak,
Yes.
Commissioner Strongman,
Yes.
Commissioner Anderson,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ward,
Yes.
Chair Reiser.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, fantastic.
Great job.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice work. My goodness.
It definitely goes to the team.
Yeah. Next up, commission considerations. Anything? That
We have nothing for commission considerations tonight.
Okay, very good. Commission member staff reports or announcements. Seeing nothing, we will, I'll adjourn the meeting. At, give me the time.
8:29.
8:29. There we go.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
I thought you said 5 minutes.
Recording stopped.